we will learn about several significant research questions. Charles Hankla will tell us how decentralized democracies are better placed to develop a pluralist form of economic upgrading. Papia Sengupta will illuminate us on how multilingualism can contribute towards building of a resilient federal state. Maya Sahadzik asks how the concept of constitutional asymmetry can help us better understand constitutional emergencies. And finally, the first speaker of the session, Carlo Basta, will deal with a provocative question of how territorially asymmetric arrangements can, in certain circumstances, be a tool and path to misrecognition rather than national recognition. It is my great pleasure to invite these four scholars and chairs of the session, Professor Balveer Arora and Professor Harihar Bhattacharya, both of whom are well-known international experts on Indian federalism. Thank you.
Because we have a very eminent panel, and to give them more time later, I thought I'll spend a few minutes sharing with you a few reflections on the theme as well as on the topic of the session. But first of all, let me express my pleasure at seeing so many familiar faces in the audience, faces that go back to my 37 years in JNU, and then the last 12 years at the Center for Multi-Level Federalism. And on the basis of that pleasure, my thanks to the organizers for giving me this pleasure to invite me to chair this session, the Central University of Haryana, and the Seidel Stiftung, and Eurac, represented here. I met her a little while ago by Elizabeth Alber, but I don't think she's there. Now, if when the PowerPoint is functional, you tell me to stop, okay? Because I don't want to take it. Yeah. So now I wanted to share with you a few thoughts on what crisis represents in the social sciences, because it's very often used. Now we know what crisis represents in the medical sciences. The crisis, a critical point, is the point where the patient either recovers or dies. Obviously, systems don't die, they don't totally recover. So in the social sciences, we make allowances for a different kind of use. Now, you can also distinguish crises according to the level which is affected. So the traditional distinction is you have a governmental crisis, you have a regime crisis. I mean, to give you one example, the level also indicates to some extent the intensity. I think that is the second crucial thing. The intensity of the crisis is linked in many ways to the level, and there is a range of consequences which then are measured to arrive at some form of assessment of how intense the crisis is. And then the third element which I would propose to you is the duration, because we have agreed that this is not a critical point. This is not something where you either have a death or recovery. So the duration is something that gives us a further idea of the intensity. You have low intensity, long duration crises. You have permanent crisis is the term that's been used. Silent crisis is one famous book on India in the 60s. And then the notion of a polycrisis. We saw this in yesterday's presentation, and I see it in the literature that's been circulated on the conference, that there are multiple crises at the same time, and therefore they don't always overlap, but they keep the system in a state of crisis over a long period of time. And here I think it is useful to distinguish between crisis and emergency. The urgency of the crisis. Now, all constitutions provide for emergency situations. Wars, that's the classic example. The in the Indian Constitution, internal disturbance was added, as you know, and the financial emergency. There is a chapter on emergency provisions, old hat. This interesting part comes when the emergency provisions are not used in emergency situations, which means there is a financial crisis that is provided for, but if you have demonetization and you have economic crisis, you use other mechanisms. And there I think one of the things that John Kincaid mentioned, the idea of, it's a cliched idea, it's attributed to the Chinese, I'm not sure, crisis and opportunity. Every crisis there's an opportunity. You must never waste a crisis. You must, so we're sticking with the conventional term of crisis. The crisis that we are talking about has two indices that I would personally track. The opportunity is used for what and by whom. Now, political leaders are prone to use every opportunity to perpetuate their stay in power or to strengthen their. So the underlying subtext of this is, and this is something you find in the literature, that this so-called opportunity is often used to restrict freedoms and rights. And therefore, traditional constitutionalism is very wary of when emergency powers are used. All this we see in the ways in which the crises were used. Let me say that among the elements of pleasure that I evoked, that as many as 15 members of the Center for Multi-Level Federalism are participating in this conference, including my dear Chanchal, who is spearheading it, and so is Haryana. So he is the co-chair, and I will hand the onerous task of keeping time and seeing that there is orderly, because under me, order can lead to chaos.
Thank you, Wilfried, for starting off the today's session with invaluable insights. Without wasting any time, and since Carlo will not have any PowerPoints, so may I request Carlo to start your presentation. You will have 15 minutes.
So thank you. And just by way of a quick introduction, I want to thank Chanchal